It was only 10 years ago that we experienced one of the largest economic recessions since the Great Depression. Today, one might observe that there has been progress. But what challenges still face our diverse Commonwealth in terms of economic growth and development? Reginald Nunnally is president of the Blue Hills Chapter of the NAACP. With 27 years' experience in economic development, as well as varied experience in public servant roles, what resources does Reginald believe are available to help aspiring business owners achieve their dreams? And how do we steer the vision of our economy to not exclude individuals from new key economic developments? Hello, welcome back. I'm Joe Collymore and welcome to Close-Ups. My guest today is Reginald Nunnally, who is president of the Blue Hills NAACP Chapter. We're going to have a conversation about economic development. That's one of the major tenets of the NAACP, particularly that here in the Northeast region. Welcome to Close-Ups, Reg.
Thank you, Joe.
Now, before we go into it, I want to share with our viewers a little bit about you and your background. You're a graduate of Providence College. You've had over 27 years in business development. You've served on Governor Deval Patrick's cabinet as the executive director of the Supplier Diversity Office for the Commonwealth. You've also served as the executive director for Mayor Menino's Boston Enhanced Enterprise Community. You've also worked with the Black Ministerial Alliance. You've worked very closely with the Small Business Administration's Minority Small Business Advocate of the Year, and you've worked throughout New England in that same capacity. And you've also served in the New England Area Conference of NAACP Economic Development Committee.
Yes.
And it's that Economic Development Committee that I'd like us to take some time and talk more about that.
Sure.
With that said, let's start with your chapter, the Blue Hills NAACP. Let's talk about where you're looking to go with your organization, what towns you serve, and then let's bring it back to a larger contextual conversation about the NAACP, what it's doing in economic development throughout the Commonwealth, and then let's look at it regionally.
Joe, and thanks for that question. The Blue Hills branch of the NAACP, we service 5 towns. It's just south of Boston. It's Milton, Canton, Stoughton, Randolph, and Sharon. Our focus really is on economic development. As a result of being the president, I was appointed by the president of the New England Area Conference NAACP that oversees the northern states in New England. And we do a variety of different things because it's not a Reggie program. It really is the different branches and what they think they might need. And then it's up to me to try to figure out what resources I can bring to that particular branch. And the branches are all over the place. Some are looking for resources around starting a business. Some are looking at housing initiatives. Some are trying to figure out how to attract more people of color to come and stay in some of the remote areas in places like New Hampshire.
Here in Massachusetts, it has a very long and rich history in economic development, minority business economic development. A number of people may not be aware of the fact that the early beginnings of the small business initiatives around economic development started right here in Massachusetts. There were a couple of pioneer minority entrepreneurs, one who headed up All Stainless right here in Hingham, another who headed up a high precision machine shop called Small Trend Engineering in Rockland. Now, fast forward, that program served to be sort of a launch point for many small business, minority businessmen who started up. We had a number of companies that actually changed their stripe, if you will, to be able to take advantage of these types of programs, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
A majority white corporation might take one of its minority employees and make them a symbolic president, a head of the company, and hold themselves up as a certifiable minority vendor.
That's correct.
You've had some experiences in looking at those types of enterprises. Tell me a little bit about that.
First off, when I was the executive director for the Supply Diversity Office underneath of Deval Patrick, it was my responsibility to certify actual, real minority business enterprises as well as women business enterprises. And it from its face, it looks very simple. You know, well, you're a minority and you get certified. What we used to tell people is that you're going through an actual investigation. We're going to investigate to ensure that you're not that sort of stand-in person. So we're going to take a look at all of your taxes. We're going to take a look at all of your financial transactions in terms of banking statements. We're going to take a look at who you employ, what educational background that you have to operate this type of a business. And after you go through sort of this very lengthy certification or investigation, if you will, then we make a determination whether or not you're an actual MBE or not. I would say 95% of the time, the people are very honest. That 5% are those people that want to be the straw individual that want to sort of come in as the MBE, but really controlled and operated by a white individual corporation. And we find about 5% of those, and we actually will not certify them. If they get through the process, someone could complain, and if a written complaint came in, then we would reinvestigate based on new evidence that we might find.
I want to talk about a particular circumstance that you were involved in your capacity in the Patrick administration. And this regarded a ruling classifying the Portuguese as a non-minority. And this is to take an excerpt from a Boston Herald 2013 article where Suffolk Superior Court Judge Douglas Wilkins wrote a ruling dated February 20 of that year that the political pressures that forced you, the former executive director of the Supply Diversity Office, in January of 2013 to keep Portuguese companies in the program have not gone away. The quote the judge wrote, have not gone away, close quote. Reggie, can you give us some context as to this story and explain what political pressures the Suffolk Superior Court Judge Douglas Wilkins is speaking of here?
You can imagine if you're sort of the leader of an entity that is bound by laws and regulations, that there's going to be some controversy. In 2009, when I took over the Supply Diversity Office, and prior to that it was called the State Office of Minority and Women Business Assistance. SAMBA.
Yes.
And in 2007 or 2008, the previous executive director had made a ruling that said that Portuguese businesses were now to be considered minority. They were already in the program as what we called PBEs, or Portuguese Business Enterprises. And under the federal regulation, they were eligible to be considered minorities as long as they participated in a transportation project funded by the transportation bill. When I got there in 2009, I began to put together a campaign to sort of right what I thought was wrong. And I would say probably around 2012, I bit the bullet and I put all of the Portuguese firms out of the program as minorities and reclassified them as what they should have been, which was the Portuguese business enterprise. The political pressure that the judge was talking about was that I did not follow process. I needed to go through the governor's office to really say and justify why I was putting them out, and I did not do that. Therefore, I had to rescind that order and then right what was a wrong and put them back in the program, but I put them back in the program under the federal statute. I believe, and I think it was in 2016 or so, that there was a lawsuit that was brought up by a white business enterprise that indicated that they were not minority, and that the work that they were being allocated was being taken away from her as an authentic women business enterprise. Again, I was brought to court, testified, and ultimately she won the case. In 2016 or 2017, the courts indicated that the Portuguese businesses could no longer be considered minority, but they could be considered Portuguese business enterprises underneath of the federal program.
Disparity studies, particularly in economic development.
Yes.
There are so many and so many different shades of, if you will, and what you speak of, I would suspect that, someone did a disparity study
Yes.
and concluded this to be the case, and this is why they were advocating to go one way versus another.
Right. In a disparity study, they happen about every 10 years. And sometimes the entities are late, so it may be 15 years. But in every disparity study, it looks for discrimination, and it looks for the number of businesses that are available compared to the amount of work that's out there for as opportunities. The most recent one was completed in December of 2017 through the Division of Capital Assets Management and Maintenance. And we're trying to determine just what the final numbers are there. Previously, the number was combined. So it was a 10.4% combined numbers between white women and minorities. And we needed to be able to understand, well, what was the minority number if the two were combined? And the minority number was actually about 3.7%, and the women's was 6.7%. There are going to be some new numbers that come out, and I suspect that those new numbers will either be right around the same, maybe slightly higher, or maybe slightly lower. And that's why we really begin to take a look at what are some of the other ways that you can legally put together a program that pretty much ensures that capable and competent minority firms participate, particularly on government contracts.
The Boston Globe had an article on the Seaport District in December of last year, and they were claiming that although the development of the area was envisioned to be something to help bring people together and to promote diversity throughout the city, that it turned out to be an area with businesses and developments focused primarily on attracting a white demographic. How does that vision like that get altered or misled along the way, and how can one avoid that in the future?
Well, Joe, the Seaport, if you recall what the Seaport used to look like, it was a place where it really wasn't so desirable. But anytime that you're close to water and you have some vision, and I believe there was a person by the name of John Drew who had a vision for the Seaport. And part of that vision was to be able to attract all types of people to come down and enjoy, because it was ultimately going to be a new community. And I think that the policy that Massport has put out there recently is an attempt to ensure that that actually happens. And what I mean by that is that it's a high-end neighborhood. There's no doubt about it. And if you don't have that type of money, there's no reason to go to the Seaport District, And I think what Massport is attempting to do, and a number of developers are responding to that, is programming some space that says, come to the Seaport. You don't have to buy, you don't have to stay, come and enjoy what we have in terms of events. That they're really trying to figure out, how do we get back on track with this? And again, I go back to that language that you put into the request for proposals for development in the area. And if you want to develop in this area, you got to tell me how you're going to attract a diverse population, from all sectors. So I think that that's going to be part of the evaluation criteria on the Seaport.
Talk to me about this other initiative that's underway, I believe headed up by Eastern Bank, where they are showing some leadership along the lines of what I believe is called the Business Equity Initiatives. It's focused on Black and Latino business owners. Can you expand on what you know about the BEI and what its focus is beyond just the obvious, and who might our listeners perhaps reach out to if they want to learn more?
Eastern Bank, under the leadership of Robert Bob Rivers, has done an extraordinary job, in terms of giving back to the community. Eastern Bank leads the region in terms of small business loans. I think one of the interesting things that Eastern Bank does is that they're now opening up those businesses to their entire network of vendors, so that they're encouraging their vendors, they're encouraging the various branches and the headquarters to utilize the businesses that go through their particular training program. If you can imagine, and there are a lot of, and I don't know exactly how many there are, but there are a number of Eastern Bank branches. What if one of those firms that goes through the BEI happens to get a contract to be the one that supplies the bank with paper? That's going to be a growth spurt right in itself. So there are a number of ways that Eastern Bank is looking at trying to boost the footprint of these minority firms. They're also encouraging them to do business with each other, because if I need paper, I don't necessarily have to go to one of the established large companies. I can go to the person that I was in the class with, because now I have 10 or 11 different businesses that I can do business with.
Why are we having this conversation? This is a rhetorical question. Why are we having this conversation about economic development, particularly in the context of the NAACP? And I'm going to attempt to answer it my way, and then I'm going to challenge you to answer it your way. A healthy community, whether it's a town, city, county, you could even go so far as to say a region, state, or country, is if they have the 5 core components that are healthy components. Those 5 components are housing, adequate housing; safety, adequate and just public safety; health, a healthcare system that provides for the welfare of all; education, to ensure that everyone has equal and educational opportunities thereof; and the 5th and final one is economic development, i.e. that translates into jobs. So when we look at the communities in which you serve, where does the economic development fit, and where does it land within those communities? Is there disparity there? And if so, how do you plan to address it on a local level? And then talk to me about how you're looking to address it on a regional and statewide level.
Well, first, in those communities, like I said, if you combine them, there's about 150,000 residents that live there. So individually, it's about 30,000 per town. And approximately 20%, somewhere between 14 and 20% in terms of people of color are there. Overall, 20%. And in those towns, there are in numbers, not huge numbers, but there are numbers of minority businesses that are there. The NAACP looks at this and we say, gee, wouldn't it be really nice if we can ensure that Black businesses are as successful as some of the other businesses that are around town? Therefore, we need to make sure that the people of color that live in those neighborhoods or in those towns, they actually frequent those businesses, whether they be barbershops, restaurants, car repair places, whatever it might be. But I must say that the former Boston Celtic, Dana Barrows, has recently purchased an old Ford dealership and converted it into sort of a basketball camp. And it's not a basketball camp that is primarily for people of color. It's a basketball camp for everybody. But the people of color, young people of color, get to see the owner, somebody that looks like them, somebody that they can aspire to be, somebody that they understand knows the type of business and can be an inspiration to them. Now, what are some of these things that we take a look at and say, well, what is important about that? Well, there are statistics, and they're well-known statistics, that really indicates that Black, African American, and Hispanic companies hire African Americans and Hispanic people. And that's very important because without those businesses, it's quite possible that those folks would be unemployed. Those people now are contributing in a major way to the culture in those towns, to the revenue in those towns, and providing a needed service in those towns. And the NAACP really wants to be at the forefront in saying, not just to the African Americans and the Hispanics to come to this here business, but everybody should be coming to this business.
What can you say to these developments that are going on in Boston right now? And what are the priorities at present relative to the commerce, the arts, the infrastructure, and what holds precedent over others?
Well, when you take a look at what's going on in Boston, and Boston is probably one of those unique towns, cities, that is almost like its own city-state. And when I look at Boston and I look at areas such as Hingham, and Hingham has, I think it's 98, 97% white. And there's probably about 2 to 3% people of color that live here. One of the things that the NAACP would like to be able to do is take a sort of a snapshot and say to towns like Hingham, take a look at Boston. Look at some of the things that Boston is attempting to do. And is there a way to replicate that to not bring more people to upset the balance in terms of having 22,000 and moving it to 52,000, but is really how can Hingham connect economically with some of these small minority businesses. And it doesn't necessarily mean that businesses need to relocate. It needs to have a policy that says, hey, our government dollars could be utilized in a way that can help businesses wherever they're at by having a policy that basically says that we're going to do business with minority companies. And I can use just the cleaning business or supplies, is that every department within government in Hingham is going to use cleaning supplies of some sort, from toilet paper to
solvents,
whatever, right? Wouldn't it be interesting if Hingham was able to say, we can't find a minority business that can supply us with all of the things that we need, but the company that we do business with, they need to go out and give a portion of their work to a minority firm as a criteria for winning the municipality bid.
So this is policy making that you're
This is
referring
policy
to.
making. This is absolutely correct.
So as to say that if and I'm not picking on Hingham, but just using as the example that you've just brought up, if the community, if the leaders of the town feel that there is a moral imperative, that there is an economic global sense of priority that we ensure that there's diversity of opportunity. And as such, they then develop policy.
That's
and
right.
if that policy is then communicated to its suppliers, so that if I'm buying X amount of product from ABC company, and maybe perhaps as that company's presentation to me, they share what their goals, what their initiatives are, perhaps I ask the question, what's your level of diversity and
That's right.
participation? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, I am. And if that was a question that was consistently asked of all, not just one, but all competitors for that particular contract, soon you would find all those companies looking for competent minority firms as a teammate to win various bids, and they would become valuable in terms of how they apply and present themselves to any municipality, if that was one of the criteria, rather, of Hingham, to ensure that they were really trying to diversify. And this was the language that they put in. You don't have to respond to that. But the town itself, in reviewing those proposals, could review the diversity aspects and provide those points. So after a while, almost everybody would become that entity that would bring a minority firm. And now I got you and me getting to understand how we both do business, and I don't necessarily have to do business with a municipality. We're becoming partners because we're getting to know each other. And I provide a good service.
And we are talking about companies that are truly capable of
That's right.
producing and delivering.
That's right.
You're not talking about shell companies or dummy companies. You're talking about real.
These are real companies,
Yes.
And I always suggested that, folks, kind of like go through the certification list, because that way you know that they've been investigated. That's one of the policies that could be put in place that gives sort of an equal footing, because I'm almost positive that there are not very many, if any, businesses in the Boston, the Brockton, Bedford, Springfield, or Worcester that know much about Hingham. We have these towns, and imagine if each town was doing business in a diversification type of a way that was allocating $15, $20, $25, $50,000 in contracts to minority firms.
I'm going to challenge you in your capacity as president of the Blue Hills NAACP Chapter to lead an initiative in promoting what I'd like to call financial literacy, perhaps in collaboration with the various local banking institutions that we have here on the South Shore. I do believe that if you can start out with financial literacy, that sets sort of like the bedrock, it sort of seeds the ground in terms of small business enterprise startups. Once one is financially literate, so to speak, then they begin to think in a commerce way and begin to figure out how best to put together a product or a service in which to then launch their own company.
Sure.
So, with that said, I'm looking forward to having you back on my show, Close-Ups, so that you can share with us an update on how the Blue Hills NAACP chapter is doing, particularly in promoting economic development and hopefully including setting in motion the foundational sets of financial literacy.
Joe, I accept that challenge under this condition, because as I had talked earlier, I talked about partnerships. And I see that you have a location here that would be ideal for having sort of sessions around financial literacy to conduct these types of financial literacy courses. I'd love to do it.
Well, that's a great challenge that I'd like to at least advocate on your behalf here with Harbor Media. So with that, again, thank you very much for being our guest. And this concludes another episode of Close-Ups. Look forward to talking to you again. This is Joe Collymore wishing you a great day.